This conference will now be recorded.
And just welcome everyone again to this discussion on career setbacks. And it's really my delight to have all of you joining, whether you're joining us live or listening. I was kind of fascinated today. I was going through one of my notebooks because of a conversation I was having. And about 5 weeks or so ago, I wrote down in my notebook I should do a webinar on career setbacks, and I put a big circle on it. So it's clearly something that's been on my mind for a while. I think it's obvious that the nature of the times that we're dealing with warrant this type of a conversation. Although I'll be really honest with all of you, I mean, in the position that I'm in as a career coach, probably 30% of my work, even in the best of times, in the most robust business environments, economic environments, we're dealing with career setbacks. So it isn't exclusive to recessions and economic shocks. This is just a nature of the way sometimes that careers occur. So we're going to engage in this conversation. When everyone registered, they submitted some questions. I had a chance to review that. I think we'll talk about various topics. Again, please put questions that you have in the chat. I'll take a few breaks to go through some of those. As a starting point, though, let me just introduce myself for those of you that might be joining for the first time. So my name is Pam Schilling, and I run Archer Career. We are a global career advisory firm and also moving into the space of building technology to support people in their career advancement. I've been a career coach officially for a decade now, but in various aspects of my work, I've probably been doing career coaching for my entire career, which is about 30 years at this point. And I've worked in the technology space. I worked for a couple of telecom companies. I worked as a management consultant doing various types of strategy work for a number of years. And I now kind of teach in the career space as well. I'm an adjunct at DePaul and enjoy the opportunity to work with younger professionals. A lot of my work is very broad in terms of the type of individuals I work with. Young professionals, later stage career professionals, very diverse in terms of career fields, business people, and individuals outside of business. So I tell all of you that because in some ways, at this stage of my own career, I've kind of seen it all, just about. I worked for a company that committed one of the largest corporate frauds ever. I spent a year working for WorldCom. You look back in my position, and no story is strange, no experience is strange. And that both grounds me, and it also creates a lot of the thinking that I have about this topic of career setbacks, because I know certain things are incredibly challenging, and I also know that there's something on the other side of that. So that's a little bit of what I hope to share with all of you tonight. And some of it's from my own personal experience. I'm not going to kid you. My own career journey has not been perfect. There's been mountains that I've climbed, there's been setbacks, and I'll share some of those experiences and what I've learned as well. A few other kind of promotional items, if you will, before we get into the topic of this evening. We continue to do these webinars all summer long. I'm always looking at the topics and the questions that you all have. The next couple of ones are focused on some aspects of interviewing, particularly for consulting. But I would say if you're a person who's in the interview process, I often use the things I've learned about highly selective positions like consulting roles with all clients. So there is something to learn from that if you want to enjoy those. And if you're someone also interviewing and you want to learn more about case interviews, I'm really excited. I've been invited to be a guest on a podcast hosted by Career Contessa in August. So I'm looking forward to that conversation. And I know that's a topic that a lot of professionals that are interviewing sometimes face. So a few of those things. And then also one of the other things that our firm is doing and I'm doing a lot of is some coaching where we have a very small fee. All of that fee is donated to a small business. We're just in the process of kind of changing that donation. Up to this point, it went to a local business here in the part of Chicago where I live in the southwest suburbs. We were able to donate over $700 to them, which as a small business was a big impact. And we're just moving to a new organization that actually provides lots of career support and services for the LGBTQ community in Chicago. We'll have some more information up for that on our website. And we take those nominations from the Archer career team. So I'm always really excited to kind of get the issues and the opportunities that our team feels are important out there. But I've had a lot of wonderful conversations with professionals that sometimes I wouldn't normally have the chance to talk with. So if that's of interest, that's on our website as well. So enough of the PR and marketing. I'm going to get into the subject matter of the evening and begin to set some of this in context. So I think a lot about patterns. I study trends, I study outcomes, I study drivers. I like to do research. And when I think about this topic of career setbacks, I think it's worthwhile to kind of lay out the landscape, the context. I think sometimes when it's us and in our own personal situation, it can seem very overwhelming and very daunting. And sometimes also we feel like the challenges that we are facing are unique to us, as if we are the only person who is in that moment who's faced this situation. And what I'm going to tell you is that's absolutely not the case, because I'm evidence of that myself in my own career again, and then also with the clients that I work with. So as I thought about this topic, I wanted to have an organizing approach. And when I think about this, I see career setbacks in three categories. One is what I'm going to call a speed bump. So these are the type of things that occur regularly, all the time. In the state of the environment today, it could just be fear. We're concerned about losing our position. We could also be in the job search, not getting interviews. Maybe you've had an interview and an offer hasn't come. Maybe you're sitting in a position, you're not excited about that role, you haven't had the promotion, you haven't had a raise in a while, the job just isn't a good fit, you're underutilized. You could be working for a supervisor, a boss that you just don't connect and jive with. And then in some situations, we have personal circumstances that require us to leave the workforce or make that choice. Those, I'm going to call them speed bumps because I think they are often temporary in nature, and not to understate or not show empathy for those. But a lot of times it's just we're in the moment and we're kind of going over that bump, but there's something beyond that bump. There's also a category that I'm going to call the sinkhole, and these can be a bit deeper and a bit more challenging, and the ways to kind of overcome them can seem a little bit harder to access, harder to reach, a lot more uncertainty. And things that might fall into that circumstance would be, being on a performance plan, being told by the organization that you may have 60 days to improve your performance, being put in the situation of a furlough where you've been either already laid off or let go, or knowing that that is coming. And then, there's the circumstance of being a part of a layoff or a reorganization or a downsizing. Some companies, as part of reorganization, people are more or less demoted. This is a time, this past spring when COVID occurred, a lot of recent graduates had job offers that they had received. Those job offers were pulled. And then I think also there's the challenge of trying to re-enter the workforce after being away for a longer period of time. I mean, without doubt, these are challenging issues that take time to work through them and have more of a longer term implication. The final category, and not to be overly dramatic, but it doesn't hurt to put a little flair into this conversation, is what I'm going to call the abyss. And when you are in this moment, and I'm speaking very emotionally, for you, you look at this as if your professional circumstance is the definition of an abyss, which is a deep and seemingly bottomless chasm. You look out, you look on the horizon, and you just don't see anything there for you. That is a very realistic emotional state. And many, many people, I think, face that. And so what could be causing that? It could be that you have an employment gap that's been, generally more than 6 months is when people start feeling very anxious. Sometimes people have been fired for cause, as opposed to a downsizing. A mistake was made, performance objectives weren't met, those type of things. In my circumstance, I did not leave WorldCom because of their fraud, but people have lost their positions because of the company's bad behavior. And some people have committed their own bad behavior. There's also companies that are going bankrupt and filing for Chapter 11. Sometimes as a professional, that creates some overhang. And then there are definitely individuals who have experiences that are, absolutely challenging on multiple levels, whether it's, personally experiencing harassment, a toxic work environment, being involved in a lawsuit, having, some type of felony convictions. I mean, these, again, are things that I mention them because I've seen them all. I had a coaching appointment one time when I was working for Chicago Booth with a fantastic student that I'd met, and they came in and shared with me that their job offer was in jeopardy because they forgot to reveal on their job application that they had had a felony conviction at age 20, which was like 8 or 9 years prior. So I've seen it. And these are the type of things that factor into the type of career setbacks that we're facing. Some of you may relate to these. It may be the experience that you've had or that you have right now. So, in some ways, I want to lay this out. One, to express again that you're not the only person who has experienced these things. Number two, we're going to talk more importantly about strategies to deal with some of this. So, as we do that, let me give you some examples. And again, to do some discussion to share that people tackle these things all the time. So I went through, as I was considering, the things I wanted to talk about in this conversation, and I just thought about the people that I know, both my friends, my clients, my family. And I was thinking about right after 9/11 occurred, and I was at a consulting firm and we had to downsize. So 50% of our staff were let go over the course of a year. And one of my closest friends happened to be part of that furlough. First, he was furloughed because he wasn't at a client. And then after we figured out as a firm that the furlough wasn't going to be deep enough, then people were essentially separated from the company. And my friend was one of those individuals. It was heartbreaking. He was a fantastic professional, super nice person, had done nothing to kind of impact that situation. It just was a matter of circumstance. And today, that individual, and mind you, this is 20 years later, that individual is a senior partner at the consulting firm Accenture. And how did they get from that place to the place where they are now? I mean, there's some of this that we're going to talk about in our strategies, but there was, a lot of hard work and, making some sacrifices that not everyone can always do. But I think some of it had to do with a persistence and not allowing that moment to define. If I come more to the present, in the past 3 months, I've worked with a number of individuals who have been unemployed right around the COVID time and have had employment gaps. And I've always done that kind of work. And so one of the things that I talked recently with a client about was how they would answer that question in the interview setting and how to hit it direct and head on and not be concerned about expressing that there was a downsizing as part of their organization and they were in a role that was identified, and that resonated with the hiring organization, and that person is starting a new job in a week. Now, on the other hand, that's a fairly short gap, say 3 or 4 months. I've also worked with people that have been in job searches for a year and sometimes longer. That gets really hard, and some of you may relate to this because it's tough to be motivated for that amount of time. And this individual, when I was working on their job search and supporting them, they were looking for kind of a teaching role at a high school level with a particular aspect to the high school that they would be a part of. And this was someone that I think by all definitions, I would say was well connected, had a really good network, had a very good track record, but had stepped out of the workforce as a parent to be in that responsible position for, a couple of years. And so re-entering the workforce became a challenge. And some of it was the timing, some of it was the constraints. But what I think I saw that worked so effectively was just being consistent every week, week after week, and telling friends and former colleagues about what they were looking for, not being blindsided when somebody else was hired for a role because they had more recent experience, just kind of taking the punches and setting up a lot of opportunity to recognize small victories. That's, one of the hardest things, I think. And that individual ultimately landed a role that was really well suited. So not only in the area of interest, but kind of a quasi part-time role, which really fit their circumstance with their family. But it took about 18 months, and a lot of doors were knocked on in that period of time. A more recent example, I actually helped my spouse, my husband, pursue his own job search, and this was last summer. And he had gotten to a point in his career where the role he was in wasn't a great fit. There had been a leadership change, and so some of the reasons that he had taken on that role were not quite as clear. And he was working in ministry and had been doing that for about 16 years. And in the approach that he wanted to take for a new position, he wanted to go back into the world of technology, which he had done 16 years earlier. And, one of the things that I witnessed firsthand in watching him navigate that circumstance was just how difficult it was to know that you could do a job and to have so many people doubt that you could do a job, and working through that and, kind of how that affects your ego and your feeling of competence. And eventually, one of the organizations that he was talking to, he had to have a fairly direct conversation and just say, you've got to take a chance. I can do this. And, a little bit of effort went into that to prove that, some of the needs for the role could be met, but it can happen. And some of what facilitated that was a lot of research about the current environment and, updating sort of the understanding of the technical world, which is different than it was 16 years ago. So that pivot is possible, but I can absolutely understand and appreciate through watching it, a lot of the people in hiring positions are very, very skeptical, but it's possible. And then, in my own situation, I think about my 30-year career, and my first job out of college was supposed to be in public accounting. I didn't get that job offer. And it was, at 21 years old, learning what happens when you put your heart and soul into something and it's just poof, it disappears. And, even some years later, when I was working in a fantastic job at a director level in a technology company, we had a leadership change. So the person that I reported to took a new position. They brought in someone new. That person and I, for whatever reason, did not get along. We just didn't philosophically think about our area the same way. And, that person called me in their office one day and basically said, you need to go find another job. I'm not going to fire you, but, for all practical purposes, you're not really a functioning leader on this team anymore. And, the writing was on the walls, and it was very devastating because, I had thought that my role had a lot of impact on the organization and the work that I did, and it was a personality conflict. So, these things happen, and when I think about my own situation, there's a moment of grief that occurs, there's a moment of denial that occurs, and then at some point there's a reality that kicks in, and how do you move forward? So, there's also some good news about all of these things, and I can say it from my own experience. With each of those setbacks, I think for me, it challenged my thinking, and I had to pursue some new avenues or some new opportunities that took me in a completely new direction. And it might be easy to say now, but those new opportunities were incredibly rewarding and probably things that I would not have otherwise pursued. And, that's perhaps some of the thinking in the characteristic of resilience that kicks in. But I think it's having a little bit of faith that, that future is possible, and that the things that we've been doing don't define us as people, as professionals. And some of those setbacks are momentary in time. I mean, even with some of those moments in what I categorized as the abyss, I've seen professionals in that circumstance that have moved on, and, then in hindsight, kind of look back and, those circumstances were formative. They were growth oriented. And so I think part of this is to also say there's a little bit of mindset of how we deal with some of these things. So when I look at all of those circumstances and I think about what challenges us when we have career setbacks, why perhaps do they magnify for some? And, what keeps us a little bit from going forward? So some of these might be very obvious to you, but I think about doubt, and we start doubting ourselves and our abilities and our worth, and a lot of, those concepts enter into our mind. We also have fear, and fear is very real. You think about Maslow's hierarchy, and when we lose our job or we have professional circumstances, the fear kind of hits all of those levels. And for some, that fear can really be extremely fundamental. Like, can I pay my mortgage? Can I pay my rent? Can I, take care of the responsibilities that I have? What if I have to relocate them? And there's a lot of things that go into the circumstances of our career and our job. But the other side of this fear is being afraid to speak truth and to speak directly and to, be bold in handling our circumstances. And sometimes we're hesitant to do that because we are afraid of, what could happen. Again, that's a very natural state. And then I think the other thing that I see often is what I call professional myopia. And I have a lot of these conversations, I stitch a few things together. And what I mean by professional myopia is that, we look at our career and we look at it in a certain lane. And what we may not be doing is looking at it from a wider perspective and looking left and looking right and looking behind us. And therefore, because of professional myopia, we just see one direction. I don't have the right education. I don't have the right skill set. I don't have enough work experience. I've been out of the work world too much. Et cetera, et cetera. And those things actually reinforce the doubt and the fear. And so, sometimes we have to expand our horizons and think about the assets that we have, even though they may not be exact. And then I think the other thing that overlays the challenge of all of this is that plenty of other people will reinforce these things and say, well, you don't have enough work experience, or you haven't been in the workforce recently, or we really need somebody who can hit the ground running. Or people may say, gosh, you've got that gap in your resume. What are you going to do about that? And it kind of reinforces. So this is all really, really challenging. And probably the approach that I take in this area of career setbacks, I suppose I listen to people to help me think about the objections that I'm going to get, the obstacles that I'm going to have. But generally, when people tell me something can't be done, I perhaps have a personality of, well, I just need to prove you wrong. And that's likely something that I have carried in my own career for, all of these years. And it's probably something I bring into my coaching. So rather than having the doubt and the fear, I actually go the opposite direction. It's like, well, I guess I'm just going to have to prove you wrong. And I don't say that to be dismissive of the feedback that people have, but everybody's got something to say. So recognizing these things, I think, is a part of this equation. Now, as we start to think about solutions, then let's understand what helps us in our careers. And I've had this conversation a couple times lately about career advancement, and so career advancement has two parts. Sometimes you're stuck and you've got to move forward. And then sometimes you're working and you want to go someplace else and accelerate what you're doing, or, move in a new direction. I think no matter what, there are a few things that help us in this regard. And these are things, again, that it does not matter what profession you're in, what, aspect, what your job is, your title, your role. So I think about these things. Fundamentally, everybody should ask themselves as a professional, what are the problems that you solve? And those could be different challenges. They could be organization challenges. They could be challenges of financial analysis. They could be challenges of sales. They could be challenges of patient care. They could be challenges of education. It doesn't matter to me. The list can go on and on. And most people have some ability to solve problems, And I think about it, we on our team have a member who was out of the workforce, I think for close to 20 years as a stay-at-home parent, doing the role of that. And when the kids were grown and adults, through a colleague of ours, I got to know this individual, and she wanted to find some challenges back in the professional workplace outside of the home, and so we talked a little bit about what it was that she does, and thinking about matters of organization and communication and dealing with all the things in the home. We found a couple of those challenges that our team was having, and put her on several different projects, and now she's working on a project for us that I consider mission critical. And what we found is that she's got a talent in kind of content writing and proofreading, and a really great eye for details. And we're working on a project where that's extremely important. And so, there's no resume behind that, but it was, a skill and a problem, and, thinking about those things. So I always encourage any professional to really understand what kind of problems that you're able to solve. And then the second thing is, in whatever you've done, how have you made an impact? How have you made a difference? This is probably one of the biggest challenges that people have in their job searches, in the circumstances that may have triggered a separation from an organization. And I think about this again from a really early career experience. I happened to, this is probably 15, 20 years ago, I was working on a project, and that project was led by Ernst & Young and one of their consulting teams. And I remember that we would have these meetings, and there'd be all these flip charts on the wall with notes. And at the end of the day, I would go home, and the next morning would come in and there was a whole packet of notes. And frankly, I thought it was amazing. And what I discovered is that there was a young professional who was probably about my age, who was on the Ernst & Young team, and every night when we all went home, that individual would stay at the office and make the notes. Well, this was fantastic, except after about 2 weeks of this, that person was no longer on the project. And I did a little bit of snooping, and I found out that, and I'd gotten to know a couple of the Ernst & Young people, and they basically said that the executives a couple levels above me couldn't justify paying for a note taker. So I've always thought about that, because different people value our impact differently. I thought it was amazing, but an executive higher up, I think, was looking for something more substantial, or they had to prioritize choices. So, thinking about that makes a big difference, and it helps in so many different aspects as a professional, as a job seeker. I think another aspect to this is really doing a tremendous amount of research and preparation. So some of you commented in your registration that you're trying to make a career pivot. And I work with plenty of professionals that do it. I've done it myself. I went from business to career coaching. I was telling you about my spouse who did this. And research can make a difference, and really digging into things more deeply. And so what you're trying to do is offset experience and knowledge. And I think about it, when I first became a career coach, I knew a lot about business. I had an MBA, and then I took a job as a career coach at Chicago Booth, where I got my own MBA, but working, now as a career advisor. And when I was a student, my career path was consulting, and I knew consulting really well. Well, now I was advising students that were doing all different kinds of careers. And I remember talking to some of my colleagues about this job called sales and trading, which is the people in financial services that sit on the trading floors and are, executing stock trades. It's more complicated than that, trust me, but that's my summary. I didn't know anything about this job, and I read a book that talked all about trading, and it wasn't exciting and it wasn't fun, but when students then came and talked to me about some things, I had some lexicon, I had some terminology that I used, I had a basis of questions that I could ask them. And so when I could combine that with other things, it enabled me to be one of the more highly sought out coaches on our team, right? So, taking a little bit of extra effort, especially when you're trying to make a career change, and then when you do, to be successful in that role. The next aspect that I think we want to think about when it comes to setbacks and how to move forward and, our careers in general is just this idea about influence. And influence can be powerful in so many ways. If you think about, especially trying to convince someone in your circumstance, whatever it is, to make a bet on you or to give you an opportunity or to advance you, that's influence. There's an opportunity to lay out a fact base, create a compelling argument, and that is influence. And so that's something that I think a lot of times in our careers we don't think as much about. We might be doing it in our jobs, but we don't necessarily do it for ourselves. I was speaking yesterday to a friend of mine, and we were having a discussion about asking for a raise. And this topic came up about influence. It's, how do you phrase that in a way, especially in the environment right now, where you lay out the fact base and what's the best way to do that? And how do you line up the contribution that you've made to match the compensation that you receive, right? So influence is something that really matters in multiple ways, all right? Another aspect to this is clarity of goals and focus. And, I can relate to this myself when I was trying to make a career change. I talked to many professionals about coaching, and I had worked as a consultant. I worked with executives. Frankly, I had coached executives. I had teams of people that I supported as their professional development manager and, informally coached. So I felt like coaching wasn't an odd choice. It didn't, to me, feel like a big pivot. But in the marketplace, when I would talk to people who were coaches, it seemed to them that this was a very huge pivot. The second time I faced this was in the same job search where I wanted to go from the private sector, the business world, into higher ed. And people kept asking me, are you sure you want to be in higher ed? Because it's really different than the business world, which again, I found fascinating. So where I started to get better in these conversations was to be much clearer about what it was I was trying to do professionally and why, and backing that up with research and knowing the job and being able to state how I thought I could make an impact. So when people said to me, Pam, why do you want to work in higher ed? I had a really clear picture about that because education had been, a big part of my whole, being. I was a first generation college student that just had so many different aspects to it, and I could speak to that very passionately. And when people talked about, why do you want to be a coach? And, quite honestly, I got a lot of questions about why would I give up 2/3 to 3/4 of my salary to go do this, right? This is the level of doubt and pushback that I got. The clearer I was that this wasn't just a fad or a whim, it made those conversations much, much easier and much more productive. So knowing what it is that you're trying to do and why, and having a very clear thesis about that matters. So these are all things that are activities and things that we can engage in. And then at the center of this is people. And I have titled them advocates for many reasons. And so what do I mean by an advocate? I mean, it's somebody who's willing to invest in you or to make an ask on your behalf, or they're going to stick their neck out and give you an opportunity. And so sometimes when we think about where our careers are, when we're honest with ourselves, we may not have as many of those advocates as we think we do, or on kind of another end of the spectrum, we have advocates and we don't activate them, meaning we don't ask them for things. So, speaking about the individual who's on my team, that person came to me by way of a referral. We have a mutual friend, professional colleague, and I was looking for somebody to fill a certain role. And my colleague said to me, hey, I know someone. And I asked, like, hey, you know me, and you know that it might be kind of tough working with me. Does this person have kind of the motivation, the learning, the willingness, et cetera, et cetera? And the answer was yes. So that's an advocate. And many times we don't test our advocates, and that can be challenging. The same kind of line of thinking, it's also really hard to get advocates created. It's not something that happens overnight. It's something that happens over time. And for all of you, regardless of your situation that you're in, one of the great exercises to undertake after this conversation is to step back and ask yourself, who are my advocates? And inventory them. And then ask yourself a second question. Have I activated my advocates? Have I asked them for things? And I could go through, we could spend this whole webinar with me giving you examples of how I have seen advocates put in action to benefit people professionally, because there is goodness. And at the fundamental level, organizations need good people. And the best way to get good people is by way of referral. So I'm going to talk about some ongoing steps to do some of this assessment, but these are some questions that you guys should ask yourself, okay? All right, so a few things now that I'm going to share with you that will give you some action steps going forward. So think about a couple of these things. So one is, what got you to this place, it may not get you to the next place. And that can be something to just reflect on, because sometimes we're trying to make changes, we're trying to move forward, we're trying to come out of a difficult circumstance. The second thing is, people do matter. And that's a very important part, but they may not matter in the way that you think. It could be knowledge sharing, it could be education, etc. And then the other thing, I tend to talk with a lot of people who have really detailed, backgrounds, also great amounts of education. And I have learned, because I have 3 degrees, one of them, I guess you would call, from a fairly prominent university, that doesn't necessarily make a difference. It might help, it might open a door, but it isn't the thing. So, sometimes people like to lean on their education. Sometimes people like to be concerned about a lack of education. There's a lot of interesting talk in the business environment right now about skill building and how that's done, and that it can be done in multiple and diverse ways. So think about, some of these things in your own situation. So how do we move forward then? There's a couple of things when I break this down again that matter in terms of support. And, building this environment to, again, move forward from where you are. So the support I think comes from several aspects. I think careers are a team sport. I think you need multiple people involved, friends, family, partners, you name it. And you need people who are honest with you. You need people who are supportive of you, people who help motivate you. And you need some of those advocates, and then sometimes people benefit from structure. So there's a lot of really interesting ways to build structure into career job searches. There's a ton of online kind of coaching programs that have popped up because of COVID-19 and the economic environment. Those are great things. There's a lot of nonprofit organizations that support job seekers. There's networking groups. You can decide if that's right for you, but sometimes having a bit of accountability. And if you are good at creating your own accountability, then there's some fun ways to do that, putting reminders in your calendar. But having a support system, I think, is valuable. And the final aspect, I would say, is trying to find other, job seekers that you can benefit from. So that way, I think you can avoid feeling a little bit alone in your circumstances. All right. And I do that a little bit in my work, where I try to build cohorts of people so that information can be cross-shared and we practice together. Now that's in a structured format, and not everybody has access to that, but you can create some of that on your own. Church organizations, religious organizations do this. Some universities do this for their alumni. There are professional organizations in different cities and locations. So if that's something that interests you, take some time to seek it out. The second thing I think is an action as part of this process is self-assessment, and doing it really. When I have had some, of my career setbacks, each one of them in different ways caused me to step back and kind of asked myself, what role did I play in what occurred, if anything? And I want to give myself a little bit of a break. There are things that we do that are completely outside of our circumstances. But I think at times I've had to ask myself, what is the lesson learned? And in one particular case, when I was in that circumstance and the person I was working for basically said, you're not on my team anymore, I was quite devastated by that, because it was the first time in my career I'd ever had anyone sort of not value me on their team. And I did not have my own ability to understand what happened. That was the professional myopia that I spoke about. And in my situation, I actually went and hired a coach. And I did that, and it was a choice that I made because I felt like I needed someone to really shake up my thinking. And I found an individual who was frankly extremely tough on me and challenged the way that I looked at circumstances, caused me to look at things upside down, and allowed me to have some balance of accountability of that situation, but also recognizing that there were some things that were completely outside of my control. Now, I am not in any way proclaiming go hire a coach, because not everyone is in a position to do that. But at a minimum, there are times when we just have to ask ourselves some really hard questions. And back to the support, I think sometimes we have people in our lives who are really good at asking hard and fair questions. And opening yourself up to that conversation is valuable. One of the things that I assess as a coach when I'm working with potential clients is that ability to be open-minded to feedback. And so, if we're having a conversation and there's something critical to be discussed, it's okay to ask some questions about it. But if you outright kind of deny, that is a sign of, not necessarily being coachable. And that is a professional roadblock for sure. So taking some of that time can be valuable. I think as part of this also, one of the actions is to manage your mindset. It is super easy to get into a conversation in your head that says, well, it's me. I don't have the right stuff. I've been out of work too long. I'm at an age that hiring is extremely difficult. All of those things are true, by the way. But the question is, how do they define you? And I try myself to, I kind of have this technique, and I'm not a psychologist by any stretch, but I allow myself like a period of time to sort of ruminate about my situation. And then I have to snap out of it. And I have to move forward. And I have to not make other people's choices for me. So, if I'm in a circumstance and, someone doesn't want to do business with me, or a client, we're not connecting and they want to end a project, there's a lot of things that I can have go on in my head and have a conversation with myself. It's good to have that, but then there's got to be kind of this engagement over on the other side of, okay, well, what do I do now going forward? That is not easy, but I think it comes down to a degree of mindfulness that is tremendously valuable. The next action that I think is worth discussing is this idea of a creative pursuit of work. And there's a wide range of ways that we can think about that, because again, many of you are in different circumstances. But, I always challenge this with some of my clients who are job seekers, who are unemployed. There's part-time projects, there's pro bono projects, there's things that can be done on a volunteer basis. There are things that can be done, through just, friends and family and offering to help people. And they don't have to be these big deals, but they are skill building. And, sometimes I will recognize that can be difficult because time is limited, there are constraints. But challenging ourselves to be able to do that is important, and kind of ideating or brainstorming and getting other people's input. I mean, when I wanted to think about this field that I'm in now of coaching, I did a lot of coaching, and I did it, in my first couple of years. A lot of it I did just on the fly and ad hoc, and I would create circumstances, and I reviewed a lot of friends' resumes. And I got better at it. And, I would do certain things that put me in new circumstances, so that I could learn and I could build a set of skills. You know, I think that that's one of the challenges that we all maybe have at later stages of our career, but I think even early stages, it's trying to do something new and skill build, so that we can continue moving forward, you know. And I think about a young professional that I know. It was actually an individual who was a student in one of my classes a few years back, and they took a job. They were working for a company here in Chicago and had a role kind of in supply chain, but got really interested in design, the field of design. And you know, they created kind of their own projects and just did them, you know, in the evening, on a weekend. You know, as I remember, took a couple of classes through, you know, Coursera, like very inexpensive classes. Did some shadowing of people at the company and started developing some skills in that arena that were, you know, if you will, resume ready. So it wasn't a full-time job. It wasn't necessarily an educational pursuit. It was just like doing small projects. And I think that that's something that is tremendously valuable, because I think at times we think about work in this very formal sense. So trying to find that opportunity can be something that's meaningful. And then, you know, the last thing that I think is worth discussing in this area of how do you get unstuck, it's the idea of taking risks. So what do I mean by risks? It's doing something that's really uncomfortable. It's doing something that, boy, it just feels like this could go great or this could go wrong. And not something that's, you know, crazy, but really thinking about whatever situation that you're in and what what makes sense. So, you know, probably the example that I can think of right now that most, you know, relevant could be a situation where you're in a job, you feel a little bit like you're under leveraged, under compensated, whatever the circumstances. The biggest risk that you might see is having a discussion with your boss about that circumstance and asking, you know, how could I contribute more? So this is some of the conversation that I'm able to have with my clients and to talk through that risk. And if you plan for it and you think about it and you position it in a way, is the risk really a risk? I mean, I don't know how many supervisors get uptight when a professional on their team says, I'd like to contribute more. That is something that, especially nowadays when we're facing, you know, cutbacks, that a lot of people want to hear. Now, the risk is that some people work for individuals who are a bit self-focused and they don't necessarily want to advance your career. They want to maintain their own situation. And so they might not be open-minded to that conversation. I completely understand that. But maybe it's having it, you know, with a different type of a professional. So, you know, the idea here, though, is to think about, in your circumstance, what is risk? You know, maybe it's in the interview setting and you've handled interviews in a certain way. It's trying to ask yourself, you know, what could I do to be bolder? One of the techniques that I often talk with individuals that I'm engaging with one-on-one about the interview setting is, you know, before you leave the interview, the conversation with ideally the hiring manager is to look them in the eye and say to them, I would really like to be a part of your team because I think I could make an impact here and be a valuable contributor to the things that you're trying to achieve. It is unusual that people actually do that at the end of interviews. And if you do, I applaud that. But just that, kind of looking at that person in the eye and telling them that. Now, let me, of course, acknowledge the looking them in the eye is now via a video camera for most of us. But it's being clear and direct that you want to come in and make an impact. In the moment, that feels very risky. It feels presumptuous. It for most of us, that's not our natural state of being, to kind of sell ourselves in that way. But it makes a difference, because as a hiring manager, and I in the last 6 months have hired, 3 or 4 people, I really want to know that you want to help me solve the issues that, we need to tackle in our business. And so by saying that, I can see a degree of motivation. Another type of a risk for those of you that are career changers is maybe saying, you speak to the elephant in the room. I realize that I, on paper, don't have the background that you might be looking for, but I want to tell you I'm really committed to this. And I will do what it takes to get up the learning curve. I respect you as a leader. I respect the, chance that you would be giving to me, and I won't let you down. That's a risk. And the person can look at you and say, well, that's crazy. Or they could look at you and say, wow, that's a really honest discussion. I'm going to take that into consideration, because I like people that are straight shooters, and I like people that show that type of motivation. And those are the type of people that I want to hire on my team. Because by the way, in a lot of positions, the skill building can be had on the job. So, these are just some things that I think about that help us press on. All right. So I'm going to make a couple more comments, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. So if you all have questions about, situations, circumstances you faced, things that I've talked about, start putting those in the chat. And I'm happy to talk about them further. I've also got some of the questions from the registration in front of me. So some of this, I'm just summarizing here in terms of where you could go next. And I've tried to make this broad enough, regardless of wherever you are in terms of the speed lump, the mountain, the abyss, which I'll call a temporary abyss. But I would step back and I would do some of this self-assessment and ask yourself some tough questions. And then by the same token, give yourself the benefit of some kudos. Really think about your value as a professional. Then do some research and understand some of the needs in the marketplace. Where are there organizations that you might be a good fit? What are the issues of the day? If you're someone especially thinking about a career change, if you're a job seeker, knowing the critical issues of the day is going to serve you well. And sometimes companies have those on their website. Sometimes they could be on their social media. It could be their priorities. And the more that you know, the more credibility you give yourself. The third thing you can do is assess your advocates. Who's in your network? What are those give and take relationships? How are you, serving others in the professional sense? And do other people know your market value? And do they know what you do well? Do they know what you want to be doing professionally? Those are all things that you can help your advocates understand. The fourth thing then is addressing your mindset. Nothing is a given, nothing is permanent. There's a lot of talent out there, but you are one of those talented people, keep pushing, build small wins. And then, by the way, build big wins, and ultimately try to maintain a state of confidence. And some of that confidence just might be, this is not a permanent situation. The state that I'm in, this is just the moment. And, allowing yourself a little bit of appreciation that what's going to happen next, there is a next. Then the last thing that I'll mention is just the degree of preparation that you will do. I prepare job seekers. I mean, that's part of what I do. I prepare people in the interview situation. I interviewed people. I mean, I did, 13, 14 interviews a few months ago. You can see people who are prepared. You can see people who are not prepared. And then you can see people that prepared 120%. And think about that. Right now, I mean, I was speaking to someone who shared with me that someone told them, so this is kind of third hand, that their company had a position posted. They normally received 200 resumes, 200 applications. They got like 600. So that can be a challenging circumstance without doubt. But if you get an opportunity to interview, what can you do to be extra prepared? The research, thinking about the contribution that you can make, really understanding the culture of the company, reading things online, that sort of activity. It can take two individuals who on paper are equal in terms of credentials. The prepared individual is going to stand out, and then there are things, again, that are outside of our control that, if a hiring manager makes a choice because maybe someone's background is a little bit better fit, that's fine. That's the way it's going to be. But that preparedness carries to the next opportunity. So challenging yourself to think about that, and then, are there new skills for the role that you want to be in that you can build at this time? And how do you do so, by the way, in an economic format, meaning you're not paying a lot for additional education? So the, message that I hope that some of this conveys is you're not alone in your circumstances. Many times the circumstances are temporary. How long they're temporary, that's another question. But there's definitely action, activity, and thinking that can make a difference to allow you to get to the place where you want to be. And that's, and having an understanding of that really matters, and what defines it. And then just constantly chipping away at it and trying to be as persistent and optimistic as you possibly can. So let's talk about some questions. What things, perhaps have I spoken about that raised a question that we could probe a little further? A situation that maybe you would be in? Questions. Well, maybe I will ask all of you a question, for those of you that are on the conversation with us live. Are there things that you've done that you think kind of connect with the conversation that I've had, or are there things that you've tried that maybe haven't quite worked, or just, situations that you're sort of trying to work your way, through a little bit generically? what's perhaps in a career hot topic or a career question as it relates to something you've experienced? Guys, think. I know it's late in the evening, but make sure everybody's unmuted. All right, I'm going to look at a few of the questions in my list, but again, if something comes to mind, feel free to trigger the signal in the chat, or also you're welcome to take yourself off video. But a couple things that were presented in the registration questions. So some of this is about one of the questions is, how much do you need to present kind of outcomes of your work in a quantifiable fashion? So if you're talking to a potential employer and the question is, what's the impact of the work you've done? I would encourage everyone to ask yourself a few layers of questions. What is the impact of my work? What is it kind of by way of description? What would be a way that I could think about that? So, I'm a career coach. Some of what I do, to be honest, is a little bit squishy. It's hard to quantify. But I could talk about, the number of appointments that I hold in a year. I could talk about, the number of networking conversations that I have. I could talk about the number of resumes that I've edited. Everything, I mean, that probably because I have an accounting and finance background, I think a lot of things can be quantified. And then another, suggestion is ask people that you've worked with, what do you think was the benefit of this? What was the potential impact, or what was the impact? And then the third thing is to estimate. That's something that, again, can be, a little bit vague, but you can say, you can sort of, well, gosh, this is something that if I think about it, it used to take 3 days every month. There's 12 months. We eliminated 2 days. I would say it's now, I eliminated 24 days a month. Gosh, if I took an average salary of somebody, it's probably, $25, $30, et cetera, et cetera. So trying to do that and really talk it through, and then, put some math to it, but at a minimum, being able to talk through it and know the impacts that you've made, that's super helpful. Another question that I received, which I think is a great one, is around technology skills. And this is something, I deal with quite a lot, both working with college students, working professionals, individuals in later stages of their career who are, maybe trying to re-enter the workforce. So every job has certain technology tools that are being used, some more than other. One of the things I think is really great when you're conversing with people is just to ask them, what do you do on a daily basis? Is it a lot of email? Is it some kind of online software application? Is it, the Microsoft Office suite, or, the Google suite, Word documents, spreadsheets, PowerPoints? There's some tools through Adobe. Ask people. And then do these things in your daily life. So, I design birthday invitations for my kids. I occasionally will download them, but I will occasionally make them. And I sometimes do this as a way to practice using things like Photoshop. So there's in our kind of family activities, I send out holiday cards every year. I have a mailing list in Excel. It keeps me fresh on how to almost use Excel like a database. And then on top of that, if you want to go a bit farther, there are courses that are inexpensive, things like Coursera, but finding a way to access some of these tools and use them a little bit so it's not just a class. And then the final thing that I would say is if you're looking at employment opportunities and that company makes a technology product, sign up for a demo or ask them, could I get a demo of the product? I was interviewing with a company at one point some 15 years ago. They had a software product that was the core part of their business. And in the interview process, I just asked them for a demo login. And I spent, 3-4 hours trolling around the software before my interview. So there's a range of things. And I think if you are an individual who's been out of the workforce, kind of investigating that, because I think that a lot of organizations are really trying to push technology tools, and technology has become much cheaper, even for small companies. So thinking about that. So there's a couple questions too about I'm doing things, I might be working, but I'm really not passionate about it. I'm feeling unfulfilled, underemployed. There's a couple of things that I recommend in that circumstance. So one is asking yourself what professionally might fulfill you, and then how do you fulfill that by other things. So as an example, I really like writing. I mean, I wish someday I, may be a writer. I perhaps should have been a journalist, but I like writing. So I like writing and I like photography. I don't think I could make a living at it, or at least not at this stage. But I do things that tap into that fulfillment. So I might put together a photo book of our family's pictures throughout the year. I might write a Christmas card letter that I attempt to make interesting for the, family and friends that I force to read it. I write blog posts. There's a bunch of things that I do. And when you have interests that aren't your full-time job, one of the things I like to say is test those interests and then share them with people, or do small projects to help people. I was speaking to a woman one time who had an interest in becoming a personal organizer, and she was a little bit uncomfortable about just quitting her job and going to do that. And one of my suggestions was, why don't you just take on a couple of organizing projects? Find 2 or 3 people. Everyone needs to be organized. Do it on a weekend, put a little elbow grease into it, and then maybe the next couple of months take on a couple projects and see if people will pay you, and then slowly work your way into it. So, the moral of the story is, what is it that really gets you more excited, more fulfilled, more committed, better using your talent? And how do you, move in that direction? I mean, even in environments right now, that can happen. Whether it's helping small businesses, whether it's helping startup organizations, where it's helping nonprofits. The trick is you might need a few extra hours in the day, or a little of the off work time to fill in some of that. So that's kind of getting back to that creative work and finding ways to work creatively. So there's a question that came through. Thank you, Lester, for that. So Lester's asking about getting a growth mindset. So for definition of a growth mindset, it is a state of being where you're constantly self-developing and thinking about betterment, trying to find fulfillment, trying to be open to ideas and experience. So a couple things, and I think that this relates to this topic of career setback, and in this way. So sometimes when we have a career setback, we look at it as a difficult to devastating situation, and we look at all the dark cloud aspects to it. The growth mindset looks at a career setback and says, I have something to learn from this. I can move to a different place. So those are, again, different mindsets that affect our psychology. They affect our sense of worth. They affect our ability to go forward. So Lester's question is, how do I reprogram? I would offer you a couple of thoughts about that. So one, this may not be the easiest thing to reprogram. So our personality, I'm not going to go too deep into the theory, but there are characteristics of our personality that are kind of embedded in who we are. There's something known as the Big Five. It's one of those assessments that are so often used, but the Big Five personality characteristics, it's one of the most scientifically demonstrated assessments. And what it tells us is that where our personality lies, and it also tells us that it's a bit difficult to change, that these 5 characteristics in our personality are a bit more static than dynamic. So what I always encourage people to do, and I will do this also with some of my clients, is to take a 5-factor assessment. You can go online, do a Google search, they're free, and figure out where you sit. And one of the personality factors is openness to experience. If you are not necessarily someone who is open to new experiences, this may be a little bit of a signal that the growth mindset is more difficult for you. And then what that tells you is how hard you're going to have to work at it, right? So here's other things that you can, do in some self-assessment. Where do you, these are a little bit weird in our current context, but bear with me. When you go out to dinner, where do you go? And over the course of a year, how many different places do you go? Again, separate it from our current environment. I know people, and I adore these people. Some of them are my closest friends. Some of them might be my spouse. That over the course of the year, if unnudged, they might go to the same 5 restaurants. I, on the other hand, every time I dined out, if I could, I'd go someplace different because I just love new things. So this just tells you a little bit about your experience. So then the question is, once you know that, how do you overcome it? And it relates to dealing with all these career setbacks. I think facing rejection is part of the growth mindset. Doing things that you might fail at, trying something new and being okay that you're not good at it. Those things help us grow. And they can be very benign. I took a painting class one time, the painting instructor asked me what I had painted. I pointed at it and said that it was a box, and he looked at me and he goes, "That's not a box." Because apparently I don't know how to paint with 3 dimensions, and that was very eye-opening, and it was not the easiest thing to hear, but it let me know that I could get better at something. So Lester, I mean, it's a long way of kind of answering that question, but if you're really trying to get better at that, you actually have to do things that you're not likely to succeed at every single time. And you're potentially going to have to take some risks. But do it in small steps and do it in things that are perhaps not so mission critical in your life. And it's totally okay. I mean, I can tell you guys I do that myself all the time because I'm still trying to grow as a professional. And then, maybe the last thing to reprogram yourself is find a friend who you guys can talk through what it is you're trying to do and how do you overcome that. So hopefully, a few of those things can, kind of get you in that direction because, and I'm glad you asked this question because I do think that part of what helps us in our careers is having a growth mindset. I think about individuals I work with who, in the later stages of their careers, have lost their position for, again, a variety of circumstances. And, I ask some questions because I'm trying to help them deal with all this stuff we've been talking about tonight. And sometimes there just hasn't been this need to continue to develop skills. But the truth is that need was there. It just maybe wasn't obvious that you needed to be on that train. I work with a lot of professionals with accounting and finance backgrounds. These days, the technical skills that you have to have in a finance job are really advanced compared to when I was coming out of college. And so, someone like me, if I had, 20, 30 years of experience, and somebody coming out of college knows how to use some of these more advanced, data analytics software packages, and I haven't retooled my skills, there's a chance that I could fall behind. And there's a chance that because I'm paid 100 to 200% more than that individual, that, at points my value might be in question. Now, granted, I have more experience. There are things that are experiential, but like these are the kinds of things that help if you can think about them in terms of your career advancement. So if we go back to the start of this conversation, and I'll put up my picture because I saw I didn't have my screen on. Each of you may find yourself relating to one of these categories of career setbacks. And, some of the things that I've tried to highlight are behavioral, they are mindset oriented, and then they are action oriented that get you moving forward. And then the difference in these different groups of career setbacks are, one, how far you are from maybe your goal, either really or perceived, and then, how challenging it's going to be. And there's a little bit of grit, not to kind of throw around, some of the fun words of the day, but I do think that there's an element of grit that's required to just say to yourself, look, this is my career. I'm going to take charge. I'm going to think about the things that I can control and influence. and I'm going to just keep working at it. And that should make a difference. And, I encourage all of you to, reflect a little bit on some of this conversation, what some of, your personal circumstances are, personal situation, and, be optimistic about the next steps. That's the best advice that I can offer. And hopefully this conversation has given you guys some ideas. It's been some, discussion of things. I wanted to evoke some thoughts for you and some ideas. And with that, I want to thank you guys again for joining. I'm going to wrap up formally, and feel free to join us for some follow-up webinars. And then again, I'll take off the recording, and if anybody has any other more individualized questions, I'm happy to address those.